that we can see everything. We take our life in our hands. That
Perfect.
looks good. Okay, so so I've called this talk Best of All Worlds: Space Drug Discovery and Drug Development because professionally I work in drug discovery and drug development and have done for many years. But a real hobby of mine also for many years, maybe not quite as many years, has been astronomy and thinking about various aspects of astronomy, including astrobiology and astrophysics and cosmology, and the opportunity to see where, if you like, the two worlds collide, which is an understanding of how drugs may be able to help on the space missions that we see today, but maybe thinking forward to the space missions for the future is something that we have to tackle as space enthusiasts, whether we're amateurs or professionals, because it's something that's going to be needed. So in the outline, I'm going to describe a little bit about the safety track record in space, take you through very quickly what is the drug discovery and drug development process, mention a little bit about effects of microgravity and radiation on the human body, most of which you'll be familiar with, but you probably won't be familiar with some of the efforts that are being done to mediate the risks for those agents. Then think about where can space help? And then think a little bit more futuristically around the field of regenerative medicine and human enhancement, which is coming to us faster than you may think, and touch a little bit on the field of synthetic biology. And then if everybody's still awake, then we'll summarize it. So I thought I'd start with this slightly irreverent, but I thought if you're Monty Python's fans and have seen the Life of Brian, which is good, see you, Bill, what have the Romans ever given for us, or in this particular case, the People's Front of Judea, with John Cleese in the middle? What has space ever done for us? And actually, there's a reason for asking that, and the reason for asking it is everybody knows of the mission on Mars. Everybody knows that we have a number of competing missions in space. The cost of doing this type of work is enormous. And when we have, as we're all aware of, problems on Earth that may seem more important and maybe are more important, we need to get the balance right between understanding what space can give us and space exploration can give us, because it's done a lot to help society and it will do in future. So I thought I'd summarize this is quite a wordy table, but this is actually at least what I can find in the public domain, which summarizes what the events have been that affect safety in space. And the fact that I can fit it on one slide tells you a lot just about how good the safety record is while in space. Now, that doesn't, of course, include some of the disasters that we know that have happened on liftoff, and for that matter, some of the very early accidents that happened with rockets exploding and some of the terrible fires that there were at the start of the Apollo program. But by and large, the safety track record in space is extremely good, with there only being one incident, at least that's in the public domain, that was life-threatening. And that was effectively an astronaut, a spacesuit expanding while they were outside the Voskhod space vehicle, and having to manually deflate it, resulting in that astronaut getting the equivalent of the bends as we have on Earth. But everything else has been manageable and non-life-threatening. So the safety track record in space is really very good, at least on short-term journeys. And the message is, as Bill said at the start, most space missions to date are really only between 6 to 9 months. Longer space missions are very, very rare, but they're going to need to be longer if we want to be able to travel, for example, to Mars, stay there any length of time and come back again. So I thought justifying our presence in space, and if you take a look at the Human Research Program, which is in the bottom bottom right-hand panel, the fact you can't read it actually doesn't really matter. The bit that's important is that out of all of the considerations, the green parts are the parts that are well managed. The red and yellow parts are the parts that either aren't managed at all or that need further work. And that tells you just how much work that the space agencies have to do to be able to understand what is the overall risk and how do we manage long-term travel in space. So NASA's Human Research Program has conducted an exhaustive physical and mental health assessment, started to think about disaster planning. And why this is important is this has enormous implications for the future, because it's an exercise in maintaining public interest and in growing and marketing the story. So for example, if we want to grow the interest in space, we have a central role as ambassadors and enthusiasts, as amateurs or semi-professionals, or maybe even professionals, and also to help engage the next generation and have those people inspired to want to seek to explore and seek to understand what space can offer us. And then we need to come down to it all comes down to the money in the end, I guess, as we all know. And what is the willingness for the majority to pay for the very, very few? So if I was to ask you, for example, let's say a crowdfunding exercise, could you give me $10, please? Because I'm really interested in this space program and I'd like to be able to raise some money to do it. Well, $10, maybe I could have $10 from you. Maybe if we were together and I was to take you to a bar that's not in lockdown, I could probably get $100 out of you if we were there long enough. But $1,000, I think you'd send me packing quite quickly. And the reason I mention that is that most of what we do in space is going to cost an enormous amount of money. Long-term missions are going to cost a lot of money. How much risk are space agencies and the general public willing to bear, and for what cost? And that's why it's so important to have a real understanding of what space can do to maintain astronaut and human health. So I started thinking about this some time ago and actually published a couple of publications that have now been superseded by two excellent publications from Rebecca Blue, looking at what drug discovery and drug development could offer us in space. And these are, I'll give you the address of the Sherwood Observatory website, because they're there. If you want to download them, they're all open access. You don't have to pay to get access to them. And they're quite a useful summary of the efforts that there have been, at least as of last year when the last review was published. So I wanted to take you through, I mentioned a little bit about the drug discovery and drug development process. And this looks a very complicated slide, but it's not as complicated as it looks. The overall process to develop a new medicine, whatever it may be, typically takes between 10 to 12 years, and the various phases of it. And the first phase on the left-hand side, the preclinical part, this is the lab part. This is where you have an idea and you start testing it. And you start thinking about, can we design a target, and can we design drugs against that target? Can we understand what we want to block? So if we're interested perhaps in exploring a new drug for Alzheimer's, we want to be able to understand what is it that causes the lack of neuron function in the brain, and what can we target our drugs against. In the clinical phase, which is the part in the middle, this is where we've got a candidate drug and we're now testing it in people. The predominant route for testing is in healthy volunteers to start off with. These are phase 1 studies. This is simply to make sure that the drug is safe. If it's safe, then it'll get tested in patients in phase 2 and phase 3 studies. And then there is the regulatory review and approval process. And all of this takes time, and all of this costs money, and it costs a lot of money to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, which is why, as you can see right up at the top, we're starting off with a large number of candidate molecules, the aim at the end of this process is to have one approved marketed medicine that's used widely by patients around the world. So this is very general. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and in the current situation where we're seeing medicines approved under what's called emergency use approval, as there has been for other diseases in the past. Ebola was one some time ago. This process can be made much shorter because we're going in at this phase in the middle. It doesn't mean to say that safety is being compromised in any way or cuts in the process are being made. We're just actually going in later in the process and we actually have a better defined molecule. So that's a whistle-stop tour, if you like, on drug discovery and drug development. And I thought on the next slide, I'd just illustrate what are the physiological effects that most of us are familiar with respect to space flight. And the ones at the bottom, muscle strength and bone density, I think everybody is well aware of. And as you'll remember from the Apollo missions in the 1960s and early 1970s, when we saw astronauts come back to Earth, we're all very familiar with the fact that none of them walked away, physically walked away, because they couldn't. They'd either lost bone mass or muscle mass, or their orientation was so messed up in their head, because there is, of course, no up or down in space. There is no gravity in space, or very, very little gravity in space. So they weren't able to orientate themselves, even if they had the strength to be able to do so. So these things that I've grayed out here that I won't describe today, an increase in space motion sickness, a decrease in what's called neurovestibular dysfunction, which is basically hand-eye coordination, a decrease in cardiovascular efficiency. Your heart doesn't have to work as hard because there isn't any gravity to push yourself against. All of these are other things that are associated with living and working in microgravity. So where can actually space help? And the area where I think space can help is right at this early phase, which is understanding what could be the potential drug targets for the future. And right at this late phase, which is understanding, can we apply a medicine that's been tested and approved on Earth in the space setting? The part where I don't think there's an application for space, at least today, is in this clinical development phase, simply because the phase 1 studies that I described a little bit earlier need typically between 10 to 50 people. Phase 2 and phase 3 studies need many hundreds, if not thousands of people in phase 3. And these are patients. So we would not be able to have enough people in space to be able to test drugs throughout the standard clinical development phase. I think today there's just under 600 people that have been in space over the last 52 years. So that takes into account, of course, all of the missions that have happened over a relatively short period of time, including the longer period of time. So if you haven't read this book, I'm going to sound a little bit like a book merchant now. I really do suggest that you read it. This is Scott Kelly's book called Endurance, around his time, just about a year on the International Space Station. It's a really very, very interesting, no holds barred criticism to some extent of the space program, but actually a very, very interesting book. And it shows just what he went through while he was in space and what he went through when he came back to Earth. For somebody who, as a NASA astronaut, should be quite rightly regarded as being an ultra-fit, almost supreme athlete. And some of the experiences that he had while he was in space and when he came back, perhaps should register a little bit with what people are up against when they're subjected to long periods of microgravity. So Scott Kelly is one of a twin, and his brother Matt Kelly, formed this now very well publicized twin study that NASA conducted. Scott spent a year on the ISS, Matt spent a year on Earth, and this allowed just about everything that could be tested from Scott and Matt to be taken and tested, comparing the effects of microgravity on the human body in space versus that in a genetically identical twin who wasn't subjected to the space environment. And the results were really very interesting. And what the analyses that were done by the NASA scientists and their collaborators included biochemical, cognition analysis, a whole range of what we call omics analysis, which is to look at what genes you have turned on and off, what proteins you have turned on and off, how your drug metabolism and food metabolism works, and a whole lot of physiological measures. And to cut a long story short, there were some quite interesting changes that were manifest even after Scott had returned back to Earth. And I won't go through the detail because the publications are here if you're interested in going through them in depth, because we could spend an hour quite easily going through it. But the bottom line is that there were changes that were quite easily recognizable between Scott Kelly's genome, how it's expressed, the proteins that were expressed, and his brother Matt. And some of those took quite a long time to return back to normal when Scott came back to Earth. So that's telling us that space is influencing biochemical and physiological pathways, and it may be giving us a tool to be able to understand various new pathways involved in disease. So again, I published two papers, one back in 2017 and one in 2018, which describe at that time the need for space medicine and actually go through the exercise regimes that are conducted on the International Space Station and have been proposed for the Orion spacecraft. And again, if you're interested, please take a look at this website, Sherwood Observatory in the UK, and you can find these publications to access if you want them. So one of the consequences of microgravity is muscle atrophy or muscle wasting, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail later. Another is fluid redistribution, which leads to what's called moon face. So the cosmonaut, in this case on the left-hand side, this is before he spent time in space, and on the right-hand side is when he spent time in space, and you can see his face is considerably rounder. And one of the things that is quite common is that for even relatively fit astronauts, they will see something like 1.5 to 2 liters of fluid redistribute from their lower extremities to their upper extremities. And perhaps in ultra fit, ultra thin people, that's quite a big problem. Maybe in some of us, certainly in me, it would be quite easy to redistribute 1 or 2 liters from my lower extremity to my upper extremity. But of course, if you're a very fit and lean astronaut, that's a big movement of fluid. The other area to know is that the loss of bone density is typically between 1 and 1.5% of bone tissue lost per month, and that's even with exercise. So can you imagine losing 1 to 1.5% of your bone mass per month, and what that would mean if you're in space for long periods of time? And again, even in very fit people, that can take 2 to 3 months to regain that bone mass when back on Earth. So this is a flag for the space agencies and anybody interested in space tourism, because for people who have generally perhaps the funds to be able to pay to go into space, they may be later on in life, because they've accumulated the wealth to be able to pay for it, they may not necessarily be the fittest people to take into space. And this type of bone loss may be something that is a concern and perhaps should be factored into the safety considerations of these types of studies. So what happens in space, and this is something that, again, I've taken from the literature. There isn't a huge amount of literature on bone loss, but typically, as we said, between 1–1.5%. So from 22 astronauts, they're losing round about 6.5 to 7% of bone mass over a 6-month period. And this dotted line here relates to a 2-year postmenopausal study of 13 women. It's there just from comparison only. Of course, these are women that have been into space, but that just shows the downward trajectory of bone mass loss over a 3-year period. So the question would be, if we wanted to think about this over the expected duration of a Mars mission, what would the bone loss be for astronauts? And would it simply just go down and start to plateau out? Or actually, would it go all the way down and follow that linear progression? And if it did, you can see that over a 2.5-year period, we'd be looking at something like a 25% reduction in bone loss, which is really quite terrific. And of course, that isn't just the bone in your legs and arms, it's the bones in your chest, it's the bones that are around your rib cage and your pelvis that support your diaphragm, or at least allow your diaphragm to move. 25% loss of bone mass would be quite difficult to manage, and certainly difficult to manage when astronauts return back to Earth. So really, what are the countermeasures? And the countermeasures are resistive exercise, and it's typical for astronauts on the International Space Station to exercise for between 2 to 3 hours a day. Loading exercise and giving them good nutrition is the second component. And another component, and again, if anybody has osteoporosis on the call, you're more than likely taking bisphosphonates and risedronate, or Fosamax as the trade name is for one of the drugs. Very, very safe, been into millions of patients. But this prevents bone loss, or at least it can prevent bone loss in a majority of patients. And just to take a cross section of a bone, this is a normal bone, and you can see there's a nice dense package of bone fibers. This is a bone from an osteoporotic patient, and this, what is called honeycombing of bone, you can see where the bone density is less, we're starting to lose some of the fine detail in the panel up here when compared with the panel down. So one of the common exercise machines is called the ARID, Advanced Resistance Exercise Device. It looks like something that you may buy at Christmas and put in a cupboard after a month or so, but the astronauts on the ISS use this, as I said, every day, and of course that's logged back at mission control to make sure that they're getting the exercise that they need. Now, there's been one study done, and this was published in 2013, and it's not the clearest of figures, so I apologize for this, but it's the only study done that I've found that best illustrates the role of anti-resorptive agents, bisphosphonates, as a supplement to exercise to reduce bone loss. So the panel on the right-hand side, so these are just different parts of the body. So the lumbar spine, the pelvis, the total hip, trochanter and femoral neck. And if you look here at the open diamond here, which is the pre-advanced resistance exercise machine score, you can see that the bone change from pre-flight spans a reasonable span. If you look at what happens when astronauts exercise on ARID, again, for all of these different parts of the body, you can see that we're starting to creep up a little bit in reducing the change from pre-flight bone mass. And then if you add on top of that bisphosphonates to astronauts that are exercising, it creeps up even further. And this is good news, because this is telling you, when you look at the means here and the bars that you can see, horizontal bars that you can see, that basically the combination of exercise and bisphosphonates attenuates the decline in really all indices of bone mass loss. So this is a very valuable study, because this study is one of the very few that have been conducted with a medicine licensed and approved on Earth and shown to positively affect bone loss in astronauts in space. So I'm going to mention something else now. So it's getting a little bit more sciencey. So there is an agent called osteoprotegerin, and osteoprotegerin is a natural decoy, if you like, for what's called the rank ligand. So what's the rank ligand when it's at home? Well, it's a substance that increases bone turnover. So in patients who have osteoporosis, their osteoclasts, which is the cells that absorb bone, are more active than their osteoblasts, that are the cells that produce bone. So the balance is always tipped against you. And that balance then leads to osteoporosis because osteoclastogenesis, as it's called, resorbs more bone than it actually forms. Well, osteoprotegerin is a substance that switches that balance. It stops, or at least reduces, the osteoclast producing cells, and it allows more bone to be produced than it is actually absorbed. And this has been shown to have a positive effect on reducing bone mass in mice flown in space. So these are experimental drugs. They're not tested in humans because that wouldn't be appropriate at this point in their development. They're tested in animals. And to cut a long story short, there have been a number of agents here that have been tested. So osteoprotegerin is one. It has a positive effect on all markers of bone mass. So at least in animal studies, it stops the formation of osteoclasts and the resorption of bone. There is another agent called myostatin, which also prevents a reduction in what's called muscle atrophy, wasting of the muscles. And there's a third drug, and I'll mention this in a little bit more detail, called formoterol. So if any of you are asthmatic, you'll almost certainly been taking an inhaled corticosteroid. And if you are a regular asthmatic, you'll be taking that in combination with a long-acting beta agonist. And formoterol is one of the best-known long-acting beta agonists. It's been in millions and millions of patients and is extremely safe. And there has been a study done showing that formoterol can have a positive effect on muscle wasting. And I'll describe just a couple of the studies in a little bit more detail here, but some of these have been published very recently, this one just last year, and this one just last year as well, showing now that these agents can positively affect bone mass loss and muscle loss in animal models. And this one here in Russian cosmonauts, published in 2017, also showing that the osteoclast system is very active in astronauts, or in cosmonauts rather, throughout some of the studies that were conducted with Russian space travelers. So where can space help? And I wanted to mention a little bit about the formoterol study. So standard laboratory studies are done in animals, and I wanted to reassure you that all of the animal studies that I see, and I see a lot of them, are actually done with very, very strict guidance. It's actually as difficult, and it should be as difficult, to do a study in animals as it is in humans, because it's only right that these studies are done out of necessity and are done in the most humane way possible. So the C57 black 6 mouse is the animal that is best studied for many studies in drug development and in drug discovery. And what these authors did, which was published last year, is very, very unique, because they took a nanofluidics system where this little reservoir, this nanochannel membrane here, forms a drug reservoir that has the drug in it. The drug was implanted in the animals, and it gives a slow release of this drug over a period of days. So you can see a cumulative release here. This is in micrograms over a 2-week period. And the experiment was really quite startling, because if we can compare here animals that were on the ground, so ground control, animals in space flight, measuring, these are various muscle groups involved in keeping the animal upright and being able to walk properly. So these are the TA muscles, the quadriceps muscles, the EDL muscles, and the GSP muscles, which stands for gastrocnemius, solarius, and plantaris. But it doesn't matter what the muscle groups are, you can see that there is an increase in the weight of these muscles when the animals receive this drug. And that's manifested also by an increase in grip strength. So this is very interesting because this is telling us that a drug that is given to millions of patients on Earth for asthma, approved on Earth, may have possibilities not just in reducing the loss of muscle mass for astronauts in space, but may also have implications and utility in human diseases where muscle mass starts to disappear. And there are many neuromuscular diseases in patients with diabetes, in patients with cancer, who start to lose muscle mass. And so it's very interesting that a drug that's been approved for asthma may have some application in halting or at least reducing that loss of muscle. So quite excitingly, formoterol has a positive effect on muscle mass, and in this case, it's in mouse studies. So I want to put this one in. This is quite an interesting one, published actually just this year. In fact, it was published just a couple of weeks ago. So if you're not familiar with C. elegans, it's a worm. And why you might think, would anybody want to look at worms in space? Well, the reason is that these worms are exquisite markers and mimics of some aspects of human biology and human biochemistry. And the neuronal signaling in this particular worm is very simple, but mimics and allows us to do some of the complex studies that wouldn't be possible to do in higher organisms. So what happened here is these were studies done on the International Space Station over a 5-day period, growing adult worms, freezing them, and then looking at how their neurons branch for animals that have been exposed to microgravity and animals that haven't. And actually what it tells us is, quite interestingly, is that there are increases in both secondary, tertiary, and to a lesser extent, quaternary branches. So what does that mean, you may ask? Well, actually what it may mean is that neuronal transmission is less effective. So if there are more branches, there is simply a greater option for the signal to be transduced, perhaps where it shouldn't be, or if it's transduced to where it should be, it may be less effective. So what the risk is, and this is where mission planners now get involved, is that the risk is that spaceflight may, over a long period of time, impair nerve signaling and function. And so the mitigation needs to be to conduct some very careful cognition studies in astronauts over a long period of time. And such studies have been underway for about, I think for about a year and a half, 2 years, and there will be more studies to come, because this is quite an interesting, if you like, flag for mission planners to be aware of. So where else can space help? And one of the areas that's been well publicized and worked on by NASA for many years is in the area of crystallization. So why would you want to get a crystal of something? Well, the reason that you would want to get a crystal, so this is a protein up at the top here. These are how proteins are drawn to protein modelers. And the reason that they're drawn like that is that we can model on our computers where drugs could bind to those proteins that may block their function. So let's just imagine that this is an enzyme, and it's an enzyme that's involved in turning cells cancerous. And we can model now on our computer how to get a drug into this area here that could stop that enzyme working. Well, a lot of that can be done in silico on a computer, but you need this structure to be able to do it. And to get that structure, it's very helpful to be able to have crystals that you can do X-ray diffraction studies on. But to get crystals, you need to have very pure proteins and the right conditions to be able to do it. And this is an example here of insulin crystals, human insulin crystals grown on the ground. You can see that they don't have a particularly well-defined shape, and human insulin crystals grown in space, they're a much better and higher, they have a much better morphology, much more regular, and would give you a much better structure than their counterparts grown on the ground. So this little cartoon here just very simply illustrates why space can help us. And actually, if you look at the panel on the left-hand side here, this is under gravity. So under gravity, the coalescence of the protein particles of the crystals to form the crystal structure is actually quite random. On the right-hand side, because there is no gravity, it's slower, it's better defined, it's more controlled. And by and large, this can produce crystals of much better quality that allow scientists to get the crystal structure. So there's been a lot of work done, and probably the one that I remember the most, because I worked in HIV biology in the 1990s. I worked at Glaxo Wellcome in those days. And at that time, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, as I'm sure everybody remembers, the HIV pandemic was something for which there was very, very little that anybody could do about it. And there was an element of desperation to try and understand how we could find drugs to combat HIV. And one of the best characterized enzymes is called reverse transcriptase. And reverse transcriptase was being explored by the Wellcome Foundation at the time. And try those scientists could, they couldn't find ways to grow crystals for reverse transcriptase on Earth. So they took the very brave step at that time in the 1990s. Of course, their space station wasn't around then. They put them up on the space shuttle, and they were able to get some crystals of reverse transcriptase on the space shuttle. And since then, there have been another number of drugs. So Keytruda, which is used in cancer therapy, have benefited by crystal structures derived from the space station, and that's manufactured by Merck, and alpha interferon for a whole range of neurological conditions by Schering-Plough. So there have been, again, some real examples here of where space has helped us with crystal studies. So growing crystals in space can produce better structures, and those better structures can produce what we call rational designs, and those rational designs should lead us to get drugs faster and hopefully accelerate drug discovery and drug development. And this is a publication, and it was only published 2 years ago. The studies were done many years before that, but this is Keytruda, the drug used by Merck in cancer therapy. And there's a really nice review here by the ISS team on the growth of microgravity induced structural crystal formation. That's a nice program overview if you're interested in following up on it. So this is the current work that's being done on the International Space Station. This is actually a microgravity crystal forming unit floating around under the cupola on the ISS. And I found this just over a week ago, so this is right up to date. And this is now how companies are using the space station to try and grow crystals for what they believe will be the drug targets of the future. So very exciting. Thut said I'm going to mention a little bit about radiation, and this is relevant, and I'll tell you why, because this now starts to get us a little bit more futuristic. So if we're on Earth, if you're not equivalent with, if you're not familiar with the units of a millisievert, don't worry about it. But we experience around about 2.5 of them if we're on Earth. If you live or work in a power station, you'll experience about 20 of them. Around about 100 millisieverts is the level at which cancer is more likely, certainly if it's well over 100. If you're in the International Space Station, you're experiencing around about 200 millisieverts every day that you're there. And then if you're beyond or in interplanetary space, of course, where nobody has been yet, but you'd be experiencing well over the dose of radiation that would be advisable. And this is a ballpark figure. There will be some slight differences, but it's a ballpark figure. So the reason I put that in is because it's quite interesting now when you start to look at what may happen if we go to Mars and if we stay there. So Mars receives round about 100 times the radiation received on Earth. And NASA now has shown with its own data that no matter whether you take men or women up into space on a Mars mission, whether they are 25, 35 or 45, the lifetime amount of radiation that they will receive is exceeded in just a 3-year mission. So it's quite interesting to think about what we may have to put in place to limit the radiation exposure to astronauts that are going to want to go to Mars, stay on there and then come back again, because right now it would exceed the lifetime limit. And there's been a very interesting group put together that's now starting to look at the possibilities of, is it possible to modify in some way the way that human beings might respond to radiation? And they're doing that in a way that's taking a very clever approach, because it's understanding the good parts of radiation damage that we use in cancer therapy for people. Why do some people and why do some tumors develop radio resistance? And is it possible to take the properties of those tumors that we would normally want to kill and use those in some way to protect astronauts from radiation damage in future? So it's quite futuristic, but there is also some data from the extremophile family, if you're familiar with them. So this little beastie up at the top is a bacteria called Deinococcus radiodurans. And again, if you're not familiar with the units of a gray, 5 to 10 gray is lethal to humans. Well, these can quite happily tolerate 15,000 gray. So they are extremely radio resistant. And this little beastie at the bottom, which I think probably everybody's seen before, it's one of the tardigrade extremophiles that can tolerate most things in life at astonishingly high levels, and can also tolerate doses of radiation of around about 5,000 gray. So the question that scientists have been asking now for many years is, well, can we find out what it is in these beasties that makes them resistant to radiation, and can we use it in some way? So to cut a long story short, what scientists have done is they've isolated a protein called DSUP, they've cloned it, they've expressed it, they've put it into human cells, and lo and behold, they found out that human cells, these are cells, not human beings, can tolerate higher levels of radiation. And the way that they do this is actually, it's quite interesting. It doesn't make them magically resistant to radiation, doesn't give them any sort of shield or anything like that. What it allows is their DNA to be repaired much, much faster. So most of damage to radiation that causes cell death is caused by damage to the DNA. This particular protein allows the DNA to be repaired much faster. And that's why this bacterium can quite happily survive and even thrive at 15,000 doses of radiation, which would kill any of us very, very quickly. So that's quite interesting. And another area that I'd like to concentrate on just for a few minutes is 3D bioprinting. So I think we're all familiar with 3D printing, which is that you can make pretty much anything that you like on Earth if you've got a computer model for it and if you've got the substrate. Well, the same is true, in theory at least, to be able to print human tissues. And there's an outfit in Moscow called 3D Bioprinting Solutions that actually started to make the first very simple 3D bioprinted organs on the space station. And they use a very, very clever system. So they use what's called magnetic levitational bioassembly equipment. So they use the microgravity experience pretty much in the same way as I showed you earlier on to make crystals. But now in this case, they used it in a way to start to make primitive organs. And on the left-hand panel here, panel C here, you can see some cells start to come together. So these are cells for thymocytes. They're starting to come together. They're starting to make something that looks a little bit more three-dimensional. And then we're ending up with something that's now starting to look like a very, very primitive thyroid gland. And here you can see there's a section here where they're also looking at this in a little bit more detail, now starting to see some very nice spheroids produce. And the intent would be that if this can be propagated and turned into perhaps something that's scalable on a large scale, could this eventually lead us to start to exploit space to produce human organs for transplantation? It sounds bizarre today, and it doesn't necessarily fit with our context of how we might provide organs for transplantation in future. But if 3D bioprinting is really a success and can be scaled almost on an industrial scale, could it produce human organs and use the space environment as a natural way to produce these structures? And again, remember that there are no walls in space. So trying to do this on Earth is very, very hard because we're trying to do it in 2 dimensions and grow 3 dimensions. In space, there is no 3 dimensions because there are no walls. So in the last 5-10 minutes, I want to spend just a little bit on human enhancement and synthetic biology. So if we think about human enhancement, probably most people think about Terminator 3s wandering around the planet, and all of the sequelae that come from that. Well, we're a very, very long way away from that. But the concept of synthetic biology and human enhancement actually has been around for some time. And I guess the question is to ask, is it realistic to start off with? Is it advisable? Is it ethical? And then really, is it essential at all? And maybe just to start off a little bit, so when I talk to people about human enhancement, they immediately think of cyborgs and artificial intelligence and what have you. But actually human enhancement in its strictest term has been around for a very, very long time. And really it's been around since before the Christian era, where the concept of magnification by using a glass of water as a magnifier was certainly, that's the first recorded event. Making eyeglasses or spectacles or glasses as we call them today has been around for hundreds of years. So the idea of human enhancement to that extent has been around for a very long period of time. And you can extend that even further to then start thinking about, well, where do you draw the line? The hearing aid is a human enhancement. A health monitoring device is a human enhancement. If you have a Fitbit or anything like that, or an Apple Watch that measures your blood pressure, in a way, that's a human enhancement. And of course, any surgical procedure, whether it's non-life-threatening or life-threatening, if it's an organ replacement or a pacemaker or anything else, that in a way is a human enhancement. So human enhancements have been around slightly longer than we think. And what I wanted to do is now just start to think a little bit about, well, what genetic enhancements could we imagine? So let's just say I'm going to go up into space and I'm going to be there for 10 years. But I know that the radiation I'm going to receive is probably going to, if not kill me, certainly do me harm. Would it be possible to enhance my genome to be more resistant to radiation? Could I be made more immunoprotective? Could I engineer or have my genome engineered to stop me losing hard tissue, to stop me losing soft tissue? And of course, there are some things that we can identify in human beings already. Some people are tolerant to extreme environments, and I'll show you in a moment. There are a number of mutations that have been identified in people who live at high altitudes who can quite happily survive off very, very little oxygen that we would find almost impossible. There are people who can tolerate high stresses, and there are people who can do amazing things, as we've seen from free divers. People, Reinhold Messner climbed Everest without oxygen, one of the first people to do it. He has something inbuilt in his genome that we don't have. Can we use that in some way? And one of the things that we can start to think about is, well, engineering that into people. So gene therapy, which is now at last got a place in medicine, can now start to deliver genes to correct a defect. And there are a number of gene therapies that are now commercially available. The idea of editing your gene, either as an individual or what's called germline gene editing, such that it's passed on to the next generation, has yet to become reality, but it will become reality one day. So somatic gene editing is already being tested in patients this year. There will be a readout of patients this year who have a terrible eye condition that results in them going blind, and yet it's a single gene defect. So if that gene defect can be corrected, it would stop those patients going blind. So they have nothing to lose, at least as far as their eyesight is concerned. It can only be a gain. And if that becomes a reality, that triggers then the potential for all sorts of gene editing approaches that could be of great benefit to mankind. So cystic fibrosis, for example, is a single gene defect. Huntington's chorea is a single gene defect. There are many single gene diseases that could effectively be stopped in their tracks if gene editing becomes a safe potential reality. So let's miss that one out. Now let's just come, this is just for completeness here, and it's just to show you that there are a number of potential molecular targets that may induce radioprotection, that could induce prevention of hard hard tissue loss, that might reduce the demand for oxygen. And I've put in one here that I couldn't resist it because this amused me. So there has been a mutation identified in a number of people in South Korea who sweat normally, but don't produce body odor. Now that seems quite strange, and you might think, well, why am I bringing this up here? Well, perhaps in the context of a space mission, when you're in close confinement with people for a very long period of time, where psychologically very small things could irritate you, perhaps, it sounds a little fanciful perhaps, but perhaps selecting people who sweat normally, because we all need to, but don't produce body odor, maybe that could be some form of advantage to consider for mission planners in the future. Sounds a little futuristic, I know, but it's perhaps not too far from reality. So in the last couple of slides, just wanted to mention a little bit about synthetic biology, because this is something that's been reality for some time on Earth. And if you're familiar with the crop called golden rice was engineered, I think, in the middle of the last decade, in fact, if not slightly before. And golden rice is just normal rice that produces high levels of vitamin A. And it was engineered deliberately such that cultures and organizations in countries where they have vitamin A deficiency can eat their supplement of vitamin A in their standard rice crop. And this type of synthetic biology for food has been applied now in many examples, typically in tomatoes, to get them to tolerate lower temperatures, to get them to fruit earlier. Synthetic biology has also been used to stop the loss of water from the leaves, the stomata in plants, while still allowing water to be uptaken. So it effectively limits the amount of water that's being used. Synthetic biology has been used to make plants dust tolerant, and also been used to give them a faster growing cycle. So again, in the context perhaps of having some form of agriculture on Mars, which would have to happen, presumably, if we're going to colonize it, synthetic biology may have a role to play. There's certainly a role to play in human enhancement, as I've mentioned just now, and in tissue generation, and perhaps even in psychological adaptation and stress management. And then finally, we have to ask the ethical questions, which is perhaps all of this sounds fantastically scientific and wonderful, but what could the consequences be? And if we're starting to make potential changes to human beings where we see a positive health impact, is it reversible or irreversible? And if there is a negative impact, again, is it reversible or irreversible? So as you can imagine, this has to have a very, very rigorous, both ethical and scientific debate, and to some extent a religious debate as well, for those who may have objections to this on religious grounds. So what may the future hold? Well, I hope I've shown you that the potential for impact in some of these areas is quite considerable. Mentioned a lot about protein crystallization and what we call structural based drug design. Target identification, mentioned some new areas that drugs have been designed against, and that also includes what we call target validation. Didn't really mention much about this drug stability and active pharmaceutical ingredient duration studies. So what on earth is that when it's at home? Well, if you and I go and buy Advil or ibuprofen, as we call it in this country, from Walmart or Superdrug, and we have it in our cupboard for 10 years, well, you may as well throw it out because it's not going to be very effective. But of course, if you're on a space mission for 10 years, you're going to have the drug for that length of time, unless you continually restock it. So scientists are actually looking right now at what can be done to prolong what's called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, to make sure that it has a longer shelf life. And perhaps another time I could talk to you about that. 3D bioprinting, I've mentioned, tissue regeneration, clinical testing, mentioned a little bit about that, and also mentioned a little bit about the use of what we call indication expansion, which is to take drugs that have already been approved on Earth and to see could they bring benefit to astronauts in space. So what could the future hold? I think the future for sure will still be around the discovery of new targets, the development of tissue engineering biosystems, the potential for human enhancement, but actually driven by the need to do this on Earth, and the need to be able to understand complex disease. There's been a lot of work done on what are called brain-computer interfaces in people who have locked-in syndrome, who can now communicate without speech. If you imagine applying that perhaps to the space environment, that may aid communication in future, and development and deployment of synthetic biology applications I mentioned already. So just to summarize, what has space done for us, or what has space ever done for us? I hope I've shown you that space has actually done a great deal for us to help us understand what we're up against, but also to help us develop some new medicines and aid in the discovery of hopefully new medicines to come. And with there, I'll finish and just ask you if you have any questions. I'll be more than